Okay, so now on to Peter.
Mhm.
Now, did you base him off of anybody?
I did actually. And this is the man who inspired my story. This is my own grandfather. And I never met him. He died before my mom was still in high school, actually, really sad. But he was a professor of German. And I actually have his textbook. He wrote a textbook. So this is one of my prize proofs. Obviously, it was written like 1959 or so. He died in 1960. So it's got this like wild pattern. But that was considered like really hip at the time. So anyway, he wrote this book. But I knew he was a professor of German. I knew he had studied in Germany. And then one year, my family, we were at Ellis Island. And I wasn't sure when that branch of the family had come to America. So I put the family name into the computer. It's a very unusual last name. So, I think there are like 5 of them in the entire United States, so very few. And I didn't find apparently they had come over before Ellis Island opened, because Ellis Island wasn't really open very long, actually. But I found records for well, I won't go there, but I found the records. Like, there's another story there, which is really great, but I'll stay on topic. But I found the records from when he had returned from Germany, because he did the junior year abroad, and when he came back, and he came back in 1936. I said, what? I knew he'd been there in Germany. I didn't realize he'd been there in Hitler's Germany. Like, oh my goodness. And I'm immediately calling my mom. Did you know he was there in Hitler's Germany? She's like, oh, kind of think of it. Yeah, it would have been. It wasn't something we had heard. She had heard his stories about being in Germany, but we just not something we'd connected. And like, wow. And then, of course, the question is like, what would it have been like to have been an American student there during Hitler's Germany? It was amazing. And then I also realizing that he would have been there during the 1936 Olympics, like at least for the Winter Olympics, which are in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, which is really close to Munich. So he would have been right there for the Olympics and right before, in the lead up to the Berlin Olympics. So I thought, wow, that's fascinating. Anyway, so that question was rolling in my head. What would it have been like? What would it have been like? Wow, you could have gotten yourself in a whole lot of trouble if you're an American. And so that was the what if question that got this whole story idea rolling. And so then I had the idea of having these 2 Americans representing these 2 different viewpoints of what life was like in Germany, and came up with my characters. So Peter Lang is very loosely based on my grandfather, other than the fact that I say loosely based because I don't know how my grandfather reacted. I don't know how some of the what I've known about it. At one point, my grandmother said, I think he was a communist. So chances are he was leaning more toward the, Hitler's evil, because he had been more, toward the liberal bent, and the liberals tended to be more anti-fascist, anti-Hitler. And so chances are he might have been leaning that way, or it might have been his experiences there bent him that direction. I have no idea, and I will never know. But anyway, but my grandfather was, so I made Peter Lang, I made him a graduate student rather than a junior student, because I wanted him a little older, more romance worthy rather than an undergrad. And so I made him a little older. I made him a graduate student who's actually in charge of the junior year students. So he's kind of teaching them and mentoring them. And but his research that he's doing is based on my grandfather's research. So my grandfather did research into, for those of us who took language lab, and we had to listen to the things I had to go to language lab when I was taking German in college. We had these big headphones on, and we had to say the word and repeat it back to us. And then you're trying to make your language sound like theirs. Well, he was doing research on that in the 50s and probably the late 40s too, because that was his graduate research was that. I found the article that he wrote, and I was like, so I was reading my own grandfather's words, and that was Oh, that was just a wonderful thing. So I did base Peter's research off of my grandfather's. So I felt like I can do that. But I don't know how my grandfather reacted to what was going on. And obviously everything else that happened in the story is pure fiction. But he definitely inspired my story.
Yeah, you have some pretty strong family history there. Was it your great uncle that you based one of your characters on in one of your other books?
Yeah, he was a B-17 bomber pilot. Yeah. Yeah. So, and the other thing my grandfather did was during the war, he was 4F. He wasn't able to serve because he had a heart murmur, and he had a rheumatic heart disease as a child. And that actually ended up, that's why he died young. He died at the age of 43 out of heart disease. So that, in fact, he was a very heavy smoker. Almost every photo I have of him, other than that one, which this photo was taken when he was about the time he was a junior, because he's got that fresh-faced college student look about him. But the other every other photo you have, he's always holding a pipe. He's very professorial. He's holding a pipe. So, but yeah, so that didn't help things. But that was before they knew what smoking did to you. Okay? So during the war, because he couldn't fight because he was 4F. But he used his knowledge, not just of the German language, but of the German culture, because he had lived there. He was also part of the German American community in America, which was actually pretty strong at that time. So he knew a lot about the culture and the habits. So he was helping to train American soldiers who were about to go into Germany. And so they had this whole program where they were, and it wasn't just German, but other languages. But so he was helping train these soldiers. And apparently most of them went over for the Nuremberg trials. So he was getting them ready for all that. So he was able to do his part for the war effort, even though he couldn't fight.
Wow. Amazing. Yeah. I've got farmers in my family history.
Yeah. You know what? That's without food, we don't eat. So thank you, farmers. I have farmers in my background too. My grandmother comes, she was an Iowa farm girl. And she was proud of it. So proud of it.
No, but I love history. And I think it's great that you know, and I'm sure you're a really good researcher to figure all that out. Research. So that's awesome that you can get all that and put it into a book for all of us to enjoy. So
it was fun.
Yes. Okay. So back into Germany. And so this book, it has romance in it, and which I love. Always have to have a little romance, and it has some action in it. And so what are most of the things that happen in that book true? Like the kind of I can't recall the exact thing, but were they burning a cathedral or?
Yeah, most of the events that happened in the story were actually based on reality. So when the Nazis kicked the Jews out of this main synagogue in Munich and tore it down, and they actually gave them notice. So they said, tomorrow we're tearing this down. And so they were able to at least get out their records and get out the Torah and things like that. So they were able, in some of those sacred items. So that I had Peter show up for that. And so that was a real event. And then Kristallnacht, which plays a part in the climax of the story, was sadly a very real event where it happened throughout Germany. It was supposed to look spontaneous, but it was very planned. And they just had rioting break out all throughout Germany, where they were burning down synagogues. They were looting stores. Kristallnacht means crystal night. And that was because of all the broken glass on the sidewalks. And in English, we often call it the night of broken glass, same reason. So it was a horrific night. I think there were 91 people that were confirmed killed that night, Jewish men. And they carted, probably off of the numbers, I think it was about 20,000 men to concentration camps. That was the first time they had really sent people to concentration camps for being Jewish. Before that, it was for political crimes. Granted, that was a lot of Jewish people, but this was the first time people were taken to concentration camps just for being Jewish. Granted, these weren't the death camps we come to see later, like Auschwitz. They were horrific places where a lot of people died, but it wasn't the murder factories that they became later. But a horrific night. There was millions and millions and millions of dollars of damage. And it kind of woke up the West, where they said, they kind of laughed Hitler off as clownish, but that was not very long after the Munich conference. And there was this kind of a lot of people in the West going, he's serious. He really means this. He's not just blowing smoke. This guy really is dangerous. So it's kind of sad, because before Kristallnacht, there was this is a common story in America throughout our history, about refugees and immigrants, and, open all the doors, no, close all the doors, open all the doors, close all the doors. So because of the Depression, it was very much close all the doors. We don't have enough jobs for our people. How can we possibly handle any more of the teeming masses? And there was a lot of anti-Semitism in America. So obviously the last thing they want is poor Jewish immigrants coming. So they really didn't want that. After Kristallnacht, there was a drive in America to increase the quota of refugees they would bring in. And there was a great uproar about it, and it amounted to nothing. So they kept the same quota, which was sadly, I think we were allowing 25,000, I might be wrong on the number there, about 25,000 people from Germany to come in every year. And they did not change that quota. At the time, I think there was like 10 times more than whatever the number was on the waiting list. So at that point, they're like, it'll take you 10 years to get to America. So, and as we know, historically, they didn't have 10 years. So it was really, really heartbreaking. Of course, we're looking at it with 2020 hindsight and saying, if only we'd opened the doors and let more people in, we could have saved another couple 100,000 people from death. We don't know. We could have saved some people from death, but they had no way of knowing the Holocaust was coming. They knew things were bad for the Jews. They just had they couldn't picture Auschwitz. They just couldn't. It was nothing the world had seen.
Yes. Again, that kind of parallels today, and it's always hard to know in the moment what to do.
And we're seeing it with Ukraine, and then you see, and of course, right now there's this great upwell of support for the Ukrainian people and letting the refugees come. And I've heard people say, and yet same thing happened in Syria not that long ago. Nobody won the Syrian refugees. What's the difference? Maybe the color of their skin and their religion. And that is sobering. That is really sobering. Where we're more than happy to welcome refugees who are blonde and Christian.
Sure. Ugh. And some of the other things I never thought of that was going on is, the Jewish business owners were kind of stripped of their ownership of their business.
Yeah, and that was all part of the German plan to get them to leave. So first to impoverish them so that they wanted to leave, because they were comfortable. They'd been there for thousands of years and they were comfortable. This was their home. And some of them had been there longer than the Germans who were their neighbors. And they considered themselves Germans first and Jewish second. Some of them weren't even religious Jews. They were like, oh yeah, my grandparents, they were Jewish. I don't practice. Some of them had converted to Christianity. But the Germans didn't care what religion you practiced. It was all about blood. So they wanted to force them out. So the first thing they did was like, well, you can't practice medicine. Okay. You can't practice law. Okay. You can't practice this. You can't have a government job. You can't be a professor. So they slowly started stripping these things away, and then it became business. But so over the years, slowly they were forcing them out of one job after another. And in 1938, they were really cracking down on Jewish-owned businesses. And that was one of the final steps. And then after Kristallnacht, they pretty much said, you just can't work unless we force you to do manual labor. You can do that. You can help build our autobahns, but that's it. So that was really kind of the final step in that process. And but at the same time, they were stripping them away. They were forcing them to turn in all their assets. And the irony, the very tragic irony, is that as they were impoverishing them, most of the countries that were accepting Jewish people required a certain amount of finances to get there. So we will let you come if you have $10,000. I'm making this up off the top of my head, because they didn't want poor refugees. They wanted refugees coming with means so that they wouldn't be relying on their systems. So in a way, the Germans were shooting themselves in the foot, because if their goal was to get the Jews to leave, they should have said, here, take the money, just go. But they were stripping away the money, and then they weren't being allowed into these countries. So the Jews were really caught in this horrific vice where they're being shoved out of their homes because they no longer can work, but no one else wants to take them. So they were really in no man's land. And it was really tragic. So I had Harold Gold as he was just a fun character, but he also came to humanize what was happening. It's one thing to read an article about these people, this is happening to these people. Another to have a character that you come to love and get to know and see how it is breaking him and leaving him stranded. So that was, he was a fun character to write, because he was funny and full of charm and wisdom, but it was heartbreaking to write him too, and see the bind that he was in.
And that is why I like reading historical fiction books, because you can almost put yourself in that position and feel really what these people went through. And
that's the true power of fiction. And I that's one of the reasons I write fiction, because it humanizes history. We can watch documentaries, we can read books, nonfiction books, and they all tell us the truth. But when you are in that character's skin, living it with that character, as we do when we're reading good fiction, it makes it real, and it makes you ask questions like, well, and the question of what would I have done in that situation is one we all kind of ask ourselves when we're reading any novel. And so it is a great way to ask these hard questions. What would I have done if I were Jewish in Germany? Would I have left? Could I have left? We often one of the questions I hear all the time is like, well, why didn't they just leave? And that was the question I had before I started doing this type of research, and realizing, oh, they wanted to leave. They couldn't. There was no place for them to go, and they had no money left. And that was just like, that was heartbreaking to read about, but to humanize it. And one of my favorite personal stories about that, my husband and my sons and me, we all like the documentaries. We'd often have the History Channel or whatever, one of these history documentaries going on. And my daughter was always like, this is so boring. It's tanks and planes. Blah, blah, blah. And she'd just storm out of the room like, oh, this is such boring stuff. Well, one day, my husband must have had some History Channel on and left the room doing his own thing, and it was still playing. I came out, I saw my daughter, and she was maybe 10 years old at the time. And she was sitting in the armchair, and I still remember, because she's all sitting with her knees up, and she's hugging her knees, and she's watching the TV with these big eyes. And what's she watching? Turn over. It's a documentary. It's about Anne Frank. Now it's a girl living through this. My Anna, ironically, her name is Anna, is watching this thinking, here's a girl only a little bit older than I am living through this. What would it have been like? Obviously, this is not non-fiction. It's not fiction. It's nonfiction. But it's through people. And that became so because of that, she became more interested in World War II. And we went to Germany about a year later. We went to the Nuremberg stadiums where they had those huge rallies. And I described one in When Twilight Breaks. And they were amazing spectacles. The photos are just, they take your breath. I mean, these spotlights, forming, looks like a Greek temple all around, the spotlights pointing straight up in columns. And then, thousands of people marching in formation with martial music playing. I mean, just incredible spectacles. I'd seen that before. So we're in that stadium, which now is obviously not grand anymore. And there is the concrete platform where Hitler stood and gave his speeches. And we all came up and we stood on that platform, and just, the sense of evil was just so palpable. And my daughter was standing down on the ground. I said, Anna, you want to come up? And she's standing there again. She's just holding herself. And she says, no. She goes, that's the man who killed Anne Frank. And I'm like, she gets it. She gets it. But she got it through story, through bonding with another human being in that same situation, So she lived that story. And that was such a powerful image for me. It's like, I want to create characters who make it as real as Anne Frank did for my Anna, so that they say, that's what it was like. That's what it would be like to live like that. So.
No, well, I think you did a good job of that.
Thank you.
So,